Welcome back to another T-Rex Talk. Today we're going to be talking about drone stuff. We'll cover a lot of different topics, and we're talking to a guy. Once again, we're sort of friends online, but we have yet to meet in person, although we're not too far away from one another, so we're definitely going to meet in person at some point in the not too distant future. But David Hahn Jr., if you want to introduce yourself and your company to our audience, we'll start our conversation on drones and drone stuff.
Sure. Thanks, Isaac, for having me. So my name is David Hahn Jr. I'm the founder of Canine Defense Technologies. So we are a hardware-first defense technology startup building in the drone space. So we focus on not large defense systems, but anything that an individual person or individual soldier, can carry. And then what's kind of the next hardware evolution for it. So we like to think ourselves as building software bodies for hardware for the software-defined battle space in a way. And I guess our unique approach is our mission statement is bridging the U.S. defense tech hardware gap for Americans by Americans. So we're in the broad context. So not only DoD customers, but also civilians, because I think that's really where the future should be headed for America. So that's kind of the background of my company.
Yeah, I appreciate that a lot. So we've talked online. I feel kind of weird saying this because I have said for years, like, friends online don't count as real friends. You have to know them in person. I do still sort of believe that, but I meet so many people online now that I have really appreciated interacting with. And so, we started talking obviously online about drone specific stuff. And some of the stuff we have talked about is sometimes more key, like low level manufacturing stuff, doing stuff here in the States, being able to make stuff in the States, find components from here in the States. But yeah, also just stuff like, as you talked about, what does a man-portable UAV solution need to look like now and in the future? It's a hot topic because there's been so much stuff over the last 3 or 4 years, mostly in Ukraine, but there's been drone activity everywhere, and people are a little more tuned into drone research now. But a lot of it is focused on, in the defense space, a lot of it is focused on the bigger, longer range drones. What are some of the key hardware features that you're wanting to bring to the table for man-portable drones and civilian operated drones, not just gigantic supply chain stuff?
So for civilian, on the man-portable side, I think that the focus I'm really directing my company toward is not on like performance or spec, as in it's not going to be a slightly higher resolution sensor. It's not going to be slightly higher range. It's more about, okay, how do we offer the most drone for the dollar? Like, how do we increase manufacturing capability easily in the U.S.? And what's like the simplest drone that a civilian can have that gives them just the core functions they need? I think that's really what we're laser focused on now in terms of our current products development. We'll worry about more advanced feature sets later, but I don't see too much of that in the industry. Yeah, there's definitely a focus on, if people are talking about civilian drones, they inevitably start comparing stuff to DJI. And for good reason. DJI drones are super easy to buy. They have amazing software features. The cameras are always improving. So in many ways, they are kind of the gold standard, but they're the gold standard as defined by a consumer electronics company that is focused on providing the consumer electronics experience, and have all the advantages of being a very large Chinese company with significant government subsidies, if not direct government attachments, and all that implies. So being able to do the basics here in the States, I think, is a huge deal, even though, when I'm looking at a drone, a lot of the times I'm thinking about it for, I don't know the right way to put this exactly, but I'm looking for a use in austere environments with limited supply chain operations. Then other times I'm just like, man, I wish I had got a drone shot for this YouTube video. I probably should have bought a DJI Air 3 because those were on sale for Christmas this year. I find myself with a foot in both camps a little bit.
So what are some of the major hurdles for providing that bare bones might not be the best term, but minimum viable product? That also sounds like you're cutting corners, but yeah, you know what I'm trying to say, fully functional, but also repeatable and scalable.
That's like, I give DJI a lot of credit for that. I mean, I don't like that, but it's impressive. Like, I think, at least from so many end user interviews and meeting a lot of like drone end users, what the industry is lacking in general is that DJI style end user experience. So as in, you buy the drone, you put a battery in, you plug it in, you slot your phone in, and then it just works, right? And it just streams perfect video. It takes perfect video. There's yet to, I don't really see too many companies actually providing that outside of maybe smaller companies in China. So really, I guess a lot of our development focuses on that, the end user experience. If you have a American-made drone that just streams perfect video right out of the box with, let's say, just only 1080p video, that's still going to be so much more better for the end user than an FPV drone streaming, filming in 4K.
Yeah. And that's one of the things that we could look down our noses as drone hobbyists. I pretend to be a drone hobbyist, but I haven't flown a non-DJI drone in a long time. I actually bought, do you remember Dragonfly, spelled Dragan? They make commercial drones now, but they got started making hobbyist drone parts. Yep. I remember buying a Dragonfly board back when it was real early days, and you would buy a board, and that was your whole drone kit, everything else, the ESC and all of your radio stuff and your motors. Like, you were on your own for the rest of the thing. All you could buy was the brain in those early days. Well, now I'm kind of a strict consumer guy, and there's a lot of drone hobbyists out there who are building and developing really cool stuff. But if you were in an austere environment and you were multitasking because maybe you were under fire or dodging this or looking for that, you would want a pretty streamlined user experience of operating the drone, something that isn't going to take a lot of fiddling or a lot of mental bandwidth. So I think it is actually really important to focus on that, even though there's other groups of folks like FPV racers that are purely looking at performance, regardless of like how much fiddling is required sometimes to get it operational.
Yeah, definitely. And it's not always going to be the most impressive airframe. I mean, like, I was looking at one of the most popular drones is the DJI Mini series. And if you get the base model, it's not that impressive, but it works. And the engineering in it is really, really interesting. If you ever take it apart, it's been just hyper optimized for mass manufacturing. You got a single board.
Yes.
The thermals all go on one layer, so you can have it cooled immediately with one piece. It's pretty impressive. And that's really what the mass distributed end effect should look like, right? Rather than the super high performance, super like spec oriented drone builds. And that's kind of an interesting take on the drone industry as a whole. Basically, right now we have military, enterprise, law enforcement, which is way up there. We have DJI and we have FPV, and that's really it. I don't really see good gap fillers.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and what I am looking for personally, if I take myself out of the YouTube content creator box for a second, I'm really looking for something that is partway. Well, I'm actually looking for both of those gaps. For my own self and skill building and pilot experience and teaching my kids how to fly stuff, I want something halfway in between FPV and DJI. And then if I were going into the field, I would want something halfway in between DJI and the law enforcement military drone. So yeah, there's not a lot of stuff in there. Skydio was kind of sort of filling that commercial and consumer gap with some of their early drones. But yeah, they ended up going straight commercial and putting all of the features and all the performance into a very expensive airframe. So we still need like a Glock 19 of drones, like a ThinkPad of drones.
It's interesting you bring up Skydio because like we talk about Skydio all the time in the drone space. like part of my assessment, I mean, it's my opinion of them, was their emphasis on autonomy actually did kind of restrict their growth in the consumer space, as in
Yeah.
it's extremely capable, extremely impressive. They managed to do visual odometry on like a tiny airframe that, the Skydio 2s are really impressive. And, you have a video on that airframe. But what did the mass market want? And they would still want the kind of dumber DJI drone that just streams good video out of the box, right? And
Right.
that gap
Yeah.
hasn't been filled yet, except through China,
Yeah. Yeah. So if you were to, can you describe the airframe that you're working on now? Like, obviously you have cut certain consumer corners, but you want to do, going back to the Glock 19, you want to do what the Glock 19 did, which was half as many parts, cheaper to make, but then engineer it in such a way that that ends up being a benefit to the actual experience of owning and using and maintaining the handgun, as opposed to an inferior product. And so that means new materials, it means better design. It's not easy to do that. But if you take away gorgeous cinematic YouTube clickbait camera from the equation, that is actually preferable for certain things. I could definitely think of situations in which I don't want as much of the drone running the camera for me as DJI occasionally does.
Yeah. So in that context, like, so behind me are two main airframes that we're public about. So Valor is like our stealth tactical drone. That one, it was built like a DJI. That's actually I started prototyping it in high school, and that's actually how I branched off and founded my company on it. And what I realized is, to build a DJI style drone in the US right now, the cost is way too high. I mean, that it starts to get in the Skydio range. So our first product last year was Genesis, it's just a basic FPV platform. And I'm not going to deny that the US supply chain and manufacturing base for drones is pretty behind. And the idea with that is, okay, let's get something out. I mean, America's behind. Yeah. We need something out. We need just a simple manufacturable airframe out. And I decided to open source it too, because I wanted a new airframe base that people can develop on. And the response was surprising, which was, I personally, quite honestly, I didn't think Genesis would actually be that successful, but the amount of interest and orders we got was absolutely shocking. I was like, this is how behind we are in a way. Like, we don't even have a basic airframe platform that we can build up new things on. So really, there's been a lot of re-strategization in the last few months on, okay, like, this is what the end user wants. We just need these simple basic capabilities and then focus on manufacturing.
Yeah. Manufacturing is huge, and materials. Do you have any weird material considerations? Obviously, once you get into certain sensors, we have talked about thermal before a bit. Thermal has some weird material considerations. Yep. But for your base airframe, are there things that you just can't get here? Are there things that are a bottleneck that other industries should work on, specifically with the goal of supporting drones and supporting American manufacturing and supporting the American citizen defense industry?
So the biggest bottleneck are probably motors, because even if you find a motor manufacturer not in China, they get their magnets from China, because motors require rare earth magnets. And the irony is, the United States has the largest supply of rare earth minerals to make magnets, but we have EPA regulation. So actually refining it is done in China. So I think even the F-35 magnets are from China. Like, that's how monopolized it is over there. So that's a big bottleneck. Now, that's where high technology innovations come in, where I've met with people who have gotten motors working in lab environments from alternative magnet sources that are super abundant and common. But scaling that to a production environment is a different story. So I would say that's that's really the biggest bottleneck now. And there's chipsets, electronics. There's been a massive, thankfully, a shift toward building non-Chinese drone electronic parts. So I think we're in good hands there. And in regards to like unique materials, something like we've been exploring is there's this stigma with drones, right? As in like drones have to be made out of carbon fiber. They need to have this specific configuration. So one thing we started exploring last year, near the end of last year, was aluminum drones. So we're taking aluminum sheet metal that's the same thickness as carbon fiber. And it's with aluminum, we could skeletonize it, which you can't do with carbon because it's too brittle. And we're getting frame weights that are the same as aluminum with the same performance. And aluminum can be laser cut, right? So you can make hundreds of frames super fast. The laser can go over in a few seconds, whereas carbon fiber sheets, I mean, you have to load it in a CNC. You have to do the dust management. It's a pain.
Right, yeah. And if you're not doing sheets, if you're doing shapes, you have layup and curing and stuff that can be a pain. Aluminum is, especially sheet aluminum, like not only is it easy to laser cut, but it's very easy to do the bending and the forming and even press stuff with lightweight brakes that you can put in very small shop areas. So that is an extremely cool thing to tinker with. And again, I am willing to sacrifice 10 performance points to get 10 affordability, scalability points. And it sounds like you could get back 100 scalability points with the ease of working with aluminum. I am kind of an aluminum fan.
Yeah. It's an underrated material, I think. There's a lot more places it can be used at. I think like we often resort to polymers, and it's like aluminum's always worth a try, like exploring. Yeah.
And there are new ways of working with aluminum. Like one of the things that I've wondered about for some of the fixed wing drones that I've been watching, there's a lot of people 3D printing fixed wing drones. And I've been wondering, would it be possible to 3D print your actual forming jigs and just press those shapes out of aluminum? Because aluminum, 3D printing is great, but it is fairly slow, and there are limits to how light you can get the material because of the material properties that you want, and then layer adhesion and various other reasons. Do you know Hoffman Tactical, by the way?
Yes,
he's been doing some. Excellent. So he's been on the podcast, but his little 3D printed TPU quad looks awesome as a small quad. But I have wondered about just getting big sheet aluminum and just pressing tops and bottoms of your fixed wing UAVs, your sort of flying wing types. If you could just do that out of a couple of pieces of aluminum with a minimal structure on the inside to hold your guts. So yeah, there's a lot of fun stuff to tinker with, and you could do a lot of design iteration by 3D printing. There's great compressive strength in a lot of these materials. You could totally stamp lightweight sheet aluminum with this stuff, and it would look so cool as well. It's another benefit of aluminum.
We did want to actually build like a polished aluminum drone and then fly it out of a Cybertruck, like that idea.
I do like that idea.
Yeah,
it's got some style to it. Yeah.
But stamped drones are stamping is super cool because you can get extremely thin aluminum sheets and then stamp in the ribbing and have the stiffness. I mean, kind of similar to what you're talking about, the clamshell design. I guess this is where like DJI has an edge, right? They have the scale to do injection molding in plastic. But if you look at all their base drone designs, like the Phantom series is pretty interesting from a manufacturing perspective because it's two plastic clamshells that are extremely thin, but they formed all the ribbing inside and everything, and then they just injection mold two clamshell halves and then just screw them together and have all the electronics just flat down in there. But you could easily do that with aluminum and do it at a smaller scale, which is cool.
Yeah. So that brings me to another question, which we've also talked about offline, and that is anti-drone measures. Do you gain some structural, you lose occasionally with some of these things. You have a little more weight. Let's say if you make some stuff out of aluminum, do you have a less brittle skin protecting your innards of your drone. So do you get a more resilient drone, something that can take bird shot a little better, for example?
Yes, and there's actually been developments in so in the military side of things. I've got to talk to a lot of counter drone guys who've done testing with shotguns like very early on, right before we even talked about drones, before it was mainstream. And there's been developments on like how do we reduce the chances of the drone getting shot down by shotguns? Like what's the resistance? And it was putting sheet metals on certain parts and things like that. But I think the main vector of like taking down a drone with shotguns is the most vulnerable thing is the propellers. And propellers. And then if you punctured a battery, it's a pretty bad day.
Yeah, and that's the thing is the propellers are a little bit more, they have more design constraints than some of the other pieces for sure. So, yeah, we have talked about doing some various tests, and so we should continue those conversations. So many people have told me that the FAA doesn't let you shoot drones down, period, because it's just a bad look. Is that really true? Like, if I get the right licenses and you have the right licenses and we do it in the right place, isn't it okay? I mean, YouTube may not like it, but what's the actual facts on this?
I've actually talked to lawyers about this, and then the actual laws themselves are like, it's pretty gray area because I think a lot of lawyers are going more on like precedents set by cases and stuff. And it's like in the context of like defense development, no one has ever gotten in trouble. But there can be some gray areas with like a normal person going out and doing it. Yet you can probably find thousands of videos of people doing crazy FAA violations with drones, and they don't have a good enforcement body for drone stuff. Yeah. Now I do know this, that on certain bases and military test sites, like it's cleared, like you can shoot drones down. Yeah.
Well, I am definitely what I would call a normal person, but I'm friends with lots of non-normal persons. And so I think this would be a good collab to do in certain spaces. I'm less concerned about the FAA directly, but like T-Rex has an FFL. We just published a whole bunch of videos on the history of the ATF. Like, I don't want to annoy every agency that there is at the same time. I don't know. That could just be an abundance of caution, but it feels like we could probably try to not avoid. We could just maybe not offend everybody at the same time. We'll just reserve a month for each 3-letter agency. Right now it's the ATF. We can annoy the FAA a little later. Yeah.
One of the silliest legal loopholes is if you tether the drone with a rope, it's not in the jurisdiction of the FAA. So I've seen some counter drone testing where they just put a thin line and it's tied to the ground. Okay. It's legally not a drone. Okay. Yeah.
I mean, in one sense that is very silly, but in another sense that is a good safety measure so that an out of control drone doesn't just fly into another county. And so it's dumb and it's not at the same time. Now, I love tethered drones from another perspective when the tether is actually able to supply power and telemetry. So now you can operate it without an RF signature, or you can operate it for long lengths of time. Have you done any of that kind of tethered drone experimentation?
So our company personally has not. I have not. I've wanted to do it. So our drones actually don't have a standardized battery mount. We like on Valor, we have a Picatinny rail. On here, we have an M-Lock compatible rail. And then the power connectors are the generic power connector in the back. And the reason for that was actually I wanted to do tethered drones later where we can have an add-on module. Tethered drones are actually pretty hard because tether weight. So you have to go with very thin wires and then supply high voltage and then do power conversion on the drone. So it's from an engineering standpoint, anyone who does that, it's pretty impressive. It's harder than it seems, but in terms of like the adjustable and forever camera tower concept with Tether drones. I think it's super cool. Yeah.
Yeah. Or radio repeater. But again, you have this issue of pretty high watts of power going pretty long distances on small wires. There's been a lot of tethered drone stuff in the Ukraine that is control channel as opposed to power. And the way that every single one of those that I've seen so far has been fiber, where you have a spool of fiber on the drone and it unspools very rapidly as it flies. And that gives you an unjammable drone that doesn't show up on any RF detection stuff. That's kind of an interesting battlefield development. But again, it's not new because we've had wire-guided missiles for decades. We shot wire-guided missiles in World War II before we figured out really good RF radio control for some of our guided munitions. So this is just a smaller, more modern version of that principle.
What's funny is that the concept is not new. So both counter drone and drone concepts are nothing new. The only difference is the accessibility of it. Especially the fiber optic drones in Ukraine. It's only possible because, again, you can buy cheap rolls of fiber optics from Asia. And that's what they're doing, right?
Yeah. I'm actually a huge fiber fan. It's interesting to me how quickly, speaking of accessibility, how quickly that has become accessible, even just for basic networking. Like we have, T-Rex is not a super high tech shop because we make plastic holsters, but we have a fair amount of fiber here just because if you want fast Ethernet, it's pretty simple to cut and join, splice, do your own fiber, and the interfaces are surprisingly cheap and connect straight to your regular network hardware. Like it is no longer a weird esoteric thing. And so, once there is that level of accessibility, all kinds of innovation can just come along, even if it is new takes on an old concept. Yeah,
definitely. Yeah, it's so interesting just how accessible fiber optics got in the last, 10 years.
Very recent.
Very recently. Yeah. And it used to be like a technology only for the military. I know fiber optic communication early on was the DoD was testing it before anyone else and setting up their own high-speed communication networks and things like that. It's very interesting history.
Yeah. So my brother David and I have talked a bit about old tech that's worth bringing back, things like field telephones between different military outposts or operating bases or even just scouting positions. And there is a tremendous value in wired as opposed to battery for a bunch of different reasons. But if you're really worried about RF signatures and various detectable stuff with really sophisticated sniffing capabilities, fiber is a great way to run even something as simple as field telephones across long distances with relatively undetectable both the material, but also the emissions from something like that. There's all kinds of stuff like that. If you had told somebody 25 years ago that we would be considering connecting what is basically just telephone intercoms with fiber optic strands,
it'd be crazy.
Yeah. And now we're just thinking like, well, what if we just had a bunch of little IP telephones, just VoIP handsets, and we just connected them over fiber, and we gave people like a couple of miles of fiber in a box with this stuff, and you could just build your own little, almost completely undetectable telephone network across a small local area. And we were, like, oh yeah, we could. It's a couple $100 of stuff on eBay, and you could just do that.
And imagine like the next generation of like the field telephones, like World War II, where they literally had spools of wire. You could literally do that even longer distances with fiber, and like you need a phone network here really fast just for a day or two. You could have a guy or even a drone run through with fiber. I think that'll be cool.
Oh yeah, the drone just zips it to you, and then you just splice the edges. Yeah, so there's all kinds of stuff that necessity being the mother of invention, and battlefields applying a lot of very interesting constraints to people. You see a lot of innovation come out of, and it wouldn't surprise me if, because Russia has spent a lot of time on electronic warfare stuff, it wouldn't surprise me if there's a lot more fiber being used on modern battlefields than we know about. And we're hearing about the drones because drones just get a lot of attention and a lot of use nowadays. So we're probably talking about a thing that is not only not new, but also is being done probably as we speak to some extent. Yeah.
Yep. Now, kind of iterating on what your brother said about like old technologies that are worth bringing back or exploring now. Something interesting with drones, and especially drones over Ukraine, is analog links and how they've made a huge comeback. Because, with digital links, it's packets, so it's very easy to disrupt. Analog links, you almost could passively know. You could, like, I heard of Ukrainian pilots getting a feel for how close they are to jammers and things like that.
Yeah.
Just based on the static. Yeah. And then,
and then just tilting antennas to and from the static and figuring out, oh, that's fascinating.
Yeah. And also with analog links, you can add video scramblers. So you basically have your own pseudo encryption. There's a lot of cool things you can do with analog video links. And what's interesting is the use of analog links even within the U.S. military for a lot of their drone systems. Like some of these larger like Group 3 platforms have both analog and digital links, right? But U.S. side has usually encrypted analog, but it's very, very it's much more resilient, and it's worth looking into. And from a cost standpoint too, it's pretty distributable. So
yeah. Yeah, that's a fascinating thing. You have less latency with analog, you can spend a ton of money to do digital stuff faster, but latency is always lower with analog, and then it reconnects faster too. So you might have good error correction of your packets maybe, but if you do get a broken link, all the handshaking to reconnect that stuff is time, whereas with analog, it's just, we can see the signal again. Now we can't. Now we can see it again. So that is a very interesting development for sure. Yeah. It has caused me to change a little bit some of my not drone related, but handheld radio and HF radio considerations. Digital has fantastic benefits in certain spaces. But then there's other times where analog is just really hard to beat. And the cost is one of those for sure.
Yeah, I guess. So when we enter more of like the perspective of, the software defined future, that's where digital really shines. And I think there's a digital C2 systems for like, command control links, and then also networking it's still pretty much in its infancy. If you think about the overall history, we've been doing a lot of analog RF stuff much longer, and I think we're just seeing the beginning of digital RF systems getting cheaper, and I'm really curious to see what the future of that looks like.
Yeah, and there are places where you can build certain advantages in. So like on the HF radio space, there are protocols like JS8 call where there's a lot of error correction. It's specifically built around super low dBi signals. But that comes with a huge latency cost. And so there's trade-offs on all these different things. And there's a lot of processing required for some of these protocols. Protocols that are super clever usually require very clever encoding and decoding on each end. But yeah, once you start building hardware encryption into your devices, digital starts to have an edge again on a lot of different things. But analog works. Like it just works. And that's one of the things where I talk to people about radio, and of course we want digital radio, and of course we want encryption, but there's also the public, what's it called? The public, we went through these concepts and I've already forgotten what they are. Our public radio, our private radio, and our secret radio. For public radio, our analog RF is just unbeatable because ham radios that were made 50 years ago that do frequency modulation, and ham radios that are $50 on Amazon, $20 on Amazon do frequency modulation. We just talk to each other. It's just easy. Yeah. So, yeah. That's pretty hard to beat.
Yeah. It's funny we're talking about radios. So when I first got into drones, like I had no idea on this RF stuff. Like I was just more of a drone hobbyist. And then as I entered more into the defense context, like it's all about RF, right? These are more of bodies to bring sensors out, and the RF is really doing all the work. Like that's almost, that's almost how I see it. And actually I binge watched like all your RF videos. Like I think that was almost 2 years ago. I was, that's where I actually learned a lot of the, your videos are like the points where I was like, oh, I need to research more on this. It was pretty cool. Yeah.
Oh, well, thank you. Yeah. So this is very cool for me that there's more development in this space, because it felt like, especially 10 years ago, maybe more, nobody was doing RF research. Like RF engineers were either employed by the United States government or Cisco building, Wi-Fi routers, or Qualcomm building cell phone antennas, or, it was big commercial type stuff. That was the only place where serious research was getting done in this space. Yep. And I think drones have actually changed that quite a bit. So like FPV, even FPV drones in particular, people squeezing more performance out of different ways of transmitting video over analog, different ways of doing stuff with digital. I really feel like drones have pushed a huge amount of people's understanding of RF in general. And so that is a very cool thing. It's not just, the big telecom and the big military guys that hire RF engineers anymore. And there are people outside of those professional RF engineers that are starting to do really complicated research. And I find that hugely exciting, partly because I was never going to be great at that. I was never going to have the time to figure some of that stuff out. And the fact that is a little more decentralized, I think, is a huge benefit to a lot of people. And I can already see it kind of getting into the ham radio space, where there are people who are thinking about ham radio as not just a way to talk to strangers with old analog gear, but like, let's really do amateur radio the way that it used to be done, where we figure out new protocols and we tweak stuff around the signal, not just building our own individual transceivers, but like really figure out this RF beast, because it's a fascinating, intangible set of problems to try to figure out. That's
it's interesting you bring that up, because I remember earlier, like drone content, let's say like articles, experiments. It's like, oh, range testing a drone. It's like all anecdotal, like, oh, if you kind of do it this way, you get 1 more kilometer. And now you watch drone content. It's like, oh, they check the antennas, they check the spec sheet, they check the radiation pattern. There's all these principles on how you mount them, and it's really come a long way. And there's the DIY drone forum. It's really old. There's so many like interesting experimentation on. I remember, if you dig way back, when the few guys were like etching their own PCB antennas, to now we have really well-tuned PCB antennas. It's like a whole science, and there's people developing them in their house and getting way more range with drones. It's really cool to see that.
Yeah. It's always fun to see that. And drones are one of the places where I think we're seeing that the most, because it is this beautiful combination of different hardware and software technologies. And so, it is exciting. And it is a lot of the research. Again, going back to Ukraine, there is horrifying footage coming back from Ukraine. But I think that is also helping people think through stuff in the application space. So like, under what circumstances would we actually use these things for more than shooting cool YouTube intros or racing? How would what would be useful applications for these things in intel collection and laying down fiber optic cables for our field telephones and artillery spotting? And then, of course, there are the direct delivery drones. The offensive drone use is really fascinating too, because I'm seeing stuff, and it's not just the FPV stuff, this hidden individual soldiers, but just the sheer cost of destroying a really expensive tank
Yep.
has come down so much when you deliver the payload with little electric motors, which is just a really fascinating concept. In many ways, these little fiber optic guided FPV drones, it's no different than a tow missile from the 90s, but it is so much cheaper than a chemical rocket fueled missile and the whole aiming console that we had to build into our Bradleys and various other vehicles back then. It's so interesting that flying that payload and hitting that moving target has gotten that cheap using off-the-shelf components.
What's funny is that ever since, I'd say, just like you talk about gun culture 1.0, 2.0, like the RC side was like, there's the RC plane hobbyists, and it's slowly transitioned into quads. And then when quadcopters start to become all the rage, it was interesting to see the conversations, right, of the potential of this technology. Like, I think even Elon Musk talked about the potential of putting explosives on quadcopters, like, a while back before we even imagined that. And it's and it all just exploded out of Ukraine. I mean, we saw some examples from the cartels and then the Middle East, but then the mass distribution of it happened over Ukraine. And I think warfare has changed forever after that. That concept is now democratized in a way, right? You see all these countries investing in these small drones now instead of missiles. And
Yeah, and you make a good point. Like, there's nothing new about these concepts. Like, we've had big cruise missiles and small cruise missiles. Like, we've had unmanned explosive delivery platforms for a very long time. But even like on the RC side, like, once you get the battery technology to a point and you get brushless motors to a point, all of a sudden you're like, oh, quads are way more fun to fly than little tiny 1/24th scale Cessnas with a little gas engine. Like, oh, this is the new RC world in some ways. And it's just a matter of certain things maturing, and the core principles are the same. You're wanting to deliver a small chunk of explosives to the part of the tank that has the least amount of armor. But doing it with little electric motors that are multi-use, you can use them, your attack drones and your surveillance drones and your delivery drones and your repeater drones, like all of these things can share motor components and various other things now. So that's another thing that changes the flexibility of the modern battlefield a little bit. Yeah.
And I guess the timing was just, I guess Ukraine was just a matter of timing on how much the industry for drones has shifted, as in, like, we've hit the peak on accessibility of these technologies, and then we have a modern war. Because I remember the first day Russia invaded, I was following very closely. It was like blowing up radar stations, cruise missiles, and then it just rapidly shifted into a total drone war.
Yeah, and I think it was a whole combination of factors. The timing was right, but the imbalance of the two nations, the fact that Ukraine is a bit more of a Western nation with a much smaller military, not part of NATO, relying on a lot more off-the-shelf stuff, and then Russia for all of its, what's the famous Soviet saying? Quantity has a quality all its own. Like, they had a lot of older tech. And the best way to fight older tech is asymmetrically with newer tech. So there are a whole bunch of different things that I think brought all of this to a head. Another one I think is plausible deniability. I think it's a lot of people are supplying both sides that don't want to be seen supplying both sides. And it's way easier to supply them with batteries and motors than it is supplying them with a particular platform of weapon that only you make. So I think there's a lot of that going on, but I wouldn't get too deep into the weeds on that on a podcast that's going to show up on YouTube.
There's a lot of that.
So this is the future because it is scalable. It is flexible and adaptable. And it's the sort of thing that has multiple benefits. It's not nearly as specialized as some of the old munitions from the past as an airframe. And it really is a flexible airframe. Like when you want to do job A, you want sensors in a spot and a drone takes them there. When you want to do job B, you want explosives in a spot and the drone is the best way to get in there. So that is really kind of the core thing that I think that people started to really wrap their minds around. And I mean, you see it in Ukraine. One of the most useful things that drones are doing is fighting the propaganda war and documenting all of this stuff for both sides, for the support of the different people who support both sides. So, yeah, there's just, dozens of different uses of drones coming out because of the different constraints of that space. And as horrifying as the war is, it is cool in a sense to see that it is public enough that a lot of people can learn the lessons from it. I think that a lot of people are thinking about these things. The lessons are a lot more accessible from this war in some ways, some of the lessons. And people are able to watch this stuff and be like, oh, this isn't something that CIA is going to figure out in a white paper. Random people on the internet like you and I are talking about the way that air access and air superiority and drone applications are developing in real time. And I think that that's really helpful, that that's not just happening inside the Pentagon. It's widespread. In the same way that RF development, it's good when that's widespread.
Yes. So it's like I think in the 2A context, we're kind of upgrading from the infantry concepts to air defense and like air warfare, right? It's now democratized. It's kind of a very interesting time to be alive. The distributed, decentralized like air defense concept with drones, the U.S. has explored that for decades. I mean, we were the first ones to field small drones that soldiers can carry and target specific systems. But now it's like, you can carry out the same end effect with off-the-shelf parts. And like you said, the Ukraine-Russia conflict was like the public kind of open sourcing of that, I guess, in a way, like the concept.
Yeah. So what is now? There's kind of two sides to the coin because these are very small devices. They run on larger supply chains in some ways, so it is much easier to democratize them. But at the same time, giant state-level actors do kind of have an edge. So huge DoD programs can build drone swarms that are hard to defend against, or they can build really powerful anti-drone technologies that are kind of hard to counter, especially if the FAA won't let you do it in certain places without a piece of string. All of this stuff is the tension that you see throughout the world of technology and weapons, where a new technology comes out. And I believe that most, if not all, technologies are a double-edged sword. And you generally see a new technology come out and you see everybody grab the handle and try to swing it in the direction that they want. So governments often are like, this will give us more power as a state. And usually little guys grabbing like, this will give me more power as the little guy. This will decentralize and diffuse some of that authority that needs diffusing. And printing press is one of these, gunpowder obviously one of these, and drones are one of these too, because state-level actors that have gigantic surveillance resources and manufacturing resources and different types of lawmaking capability have the ability to try to claim huge chunks of the drone space for themselves. But this technology is pretty widely spread already. It's pretty evenly distributed. It's pretty hard to claw a lot of that back.
Yeah. What's funny with the small drones is how behind the DoD is in one regard. So like if you look at like AeroVironment's family of products, they're at like atrociously high cost, right? Compared to what you can build the same capabilities with hobby parts pretty much. I mean, it may not have the same resilience, it may not be to their same spec, but the interesting thing, the unique position with drones is that yes, the government has explored and experimented with this decades before anyone else, but the commercial off the shelf technologies have in a way exceeded the slower, less distributed development that they're used to. The biggest challenge now is going to be legislation, because there's already a lot of focus on legislation to kind of stifle the individual developments of this technology.
Yeah. Yeah, and some of the counter drone stuff, I think the government will have an edge. Like if we go with a electronic warfare approach, the RF side and the jamming side, like it's very hard for us to build and test some of that stuff. If you need to dump kilowatts of energy into a drone brain, like sounds like a fun project, but it also sounds like a terrifyingly dangerous thing for me to try to build myself out of several used microwaves, uncaged and overclocked.
Yeah, like the microwave drone weapons, only the government would probably have that, definitely. And even with, I'm friends with some guys who worked on that stuff, and it's like even the approval within the government to even fire that once is pretty insane, because you'll interfere with anything within like 100 miles.
Yeah. So obviously some like phased array antennas that let you really focus that down on specific tiny flying targets is the way to go. But it's going to be an interesting time. Now, in addition to small hobbyists building stuff and innovating with cool things, and then the really big prime defense contractors like General Dynamics making big drones, there are starting to be more players in the middle. So have you been following AntiDrone and some of their stuff? Because their stuff is not cheap. Like a lot of their stuff is not in my price range. And a lot of it is also just like, I don't think I'm allowed to have their Roadrunner, which is designed to shoot down, like it is an interceptor drone.
Yeah.
It is an anti-aircraft missile, essentially, is what that thing is. I'm pretty sure that I'm not supposed to own one of those things. But how are they operating as a fellow drone developer? Like, how are they operating? Because they're definitely more on the lower end in terms of price and scalability and innovation speed. Like they're a small, nimble company compared to a lot of the primes, but they are building very capable and ultimately pretty expensive stuff. Like, how do you see them on this large playing field of different levels of developers?
They're kind of so Anduril calls himself a software company, and their hardware is bodies for their software, basically, right? It's like the effect of their software. And then the way they design products kind of really does follow through with that philosophy. So it's interesting to see that the larger there are drone classes in Bolt and Ghost and Roadrunner that Anduril makes that the primes do make. But they're more building with the older philosophy of, okay, how do we enter the air defense picture with smaller systems? And Anduril is kind of more of forging that path of, okay, these type of systems, but a little bit more catered to the DoD, right? Like what's the future of that? So I think they're doing pretty cool work in there. And in fact, actually, how my company started was I was right out of high school. I wanted a job there. So I was building these prototypes, like hoping like I'll get a job. Originally. And then I realized that, okay, they're filling that middle gap. There's an even smaller, lower gap. And that's
right. Yeah. And they started off as a relatively small, scrappy company. They started out as a small, scrappy company at like $1 billion cap, but they are now, I think, an $8 billion company. I was on their website recently looking at their Lattice SDK, but I just checked their job openings, as one does, and they're hiring about 850 positions right now. Not 850 people. They have like 850 positions open. Many of those need multiple people in them. So yeah, they are rapidly growing, large company, building some of these things. Have you looked at their Lattice system? As a software system, they're open sourcing somewhat a big chunk of their underlying battle space operating system.
Yeah, I did check it out, and like we're building certain products that can plug straight into it, or are going to be designed to. But I mean, the main reason why they open source it is they're a software company, and then the more systems that plug into it, the better it is.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And Anduril was. I call myself, like, I tell people I'm an Anduril fanboy, like how some people like Nike, like as in it's like it's a cool brand too, right? And I have friends there who work there, but they are transitioning more, in my opinion, to be another prime, right? Like, to be a new high speed technology focused prime. Yeah,
which is less cool for me because I love the concept of a citizen defense industry. But at the same time, I recognize that the government does have certain jobs. The United States government does way more jobs than they should. They've made their jurisdiction way too big, and they've taken lots of responsibilities away from people. But national defense is a thing that the government should have a role in. And so I love the fact that the big stagnant defense contracting development side of things, where projects take 25, 26 years on average to deliver, I love that that's being disrupted, alongside of the fact that there's also a citizen defense industry emerging. So I definitely see Anduril as an ally in shaking up one of our more sluggish and corrupt systems. I should probably clarify the word corrupt. Like, I don't feel like there's just full-on bribery type corruption, but it is just such a politically motivated system.
Like extreme inefficiency. Yeah.
And politically motivated inefficiencies.
And political motivated, yeah. And another interesting thing is, like, we are going to build in the citizen defense industry, like my company, and I'm focused on that. And but we also do, like, serve DoD customers and stuff, and we'll have more.
They have a legitimate role if they're doing their legitimate work. 100%.
We'll have more announcements on that publicly. I can't discuss the details on it now, but what interesting thing with Genesis, right? It's fully open source. The reason why I open sourced it was for citizens and civilians, right? That was the idea. But we're working with certain DoD customers that don't have much of a let's say, leverage on getting systems they need, right? Because the government's so big. And these are the kind of guys who can't afford Anduril type systems. But off-the-shelf systems are also locked down, and they're all from DJI. And because our platform's open source and it's within a very competitive, more like civilian-focused price range, it's really benefiting them. And there's a lot of actual pipelines from focusing on building for civilians that can help actual end users for national security that need these systems. And another interesting thing was even larger divisions within the DoD. A lot of these drone systems are in storage, because I've talked to, like, Army commanders, for example. They're like, we can't justify giving this $50,000 drone to one of our guys, and if they destroy it, well, I get in trouble. So they're not these price inefficiencies, and in some ways, the simple way to say is corruption is really, really killing us, and it's very problematic. And that's where actually the civilian space can help pipeline and solve too. Yeah.
And there should always be that level of tension, good competition and collaboration in the public and private sector. Like, occasionally there will be new technologies like jet engines. Only Bell Labs can make jet engines, and the only customer who can afford to buy them is the government. But after a little while, like not very long, jet engines will be cheaper, and then everybody's going to want to fly on jetliners. And sometimes it goes the other way, where it's like, well, it's time for us to go to war with so-and-so, and private companies have figured out that magazine-fed weapons work now, and everybody owns magazine-fed weapons, so now the government has to buy them because they don't want to get left behind. So ideally, in an ideal situation with actual liberty and freedom, both of these things are going to work together, and they're actually going to work together. They're not going to coexist peacefully, but they're actually going to be contributing to one another and holding each other in check where they need to be, encouraging each other in other areas where they need to be. So our system is so out of whack right now, it's hard to visualize that. But I actually see a really interesting possibility where Anduril, being a software company, builds software that proves itself in the public sector applications. They sell stuff to the DoD folks. They create a lot of good competition amongst the other defense contractors. And then guys like you come along and build stuff that runs on their software in the smaller space.
Yep.
So there is an option here for them to enable a lot of development that's going to improve both sides of this coin. And it'll go both ways. The little guys will innovate and demonstrate that markets and needs exist for things that Anduril hasn't looked at or, done the research on. Like, there's a lot of opportunities for this to happen, and I'm hopeful that that is the case. So, yeah, I appreciate everything that you're doing and our conversations around this a lot, because I think it has big and hopefully positive implications.
Yeah, definitely. And I think that it's interesting transition point. Like, we're in a very unique time where there were more soldiers in our military running DJI drones before they got banned and blacklisted within the DoD. DJI drones don't fit the spec for DoD, group one systems, but it's just so easy and ubiquitous. And we're seeing these consumer drone technologies, or like commercial off-the-shelf built technologies, can advance faster, and they may, our drones may not, at least the public airplanes we have, may not fit the spec of most DoD customers, but they still buy it because there's no other options that are good that fit within that budget range. And we're going to see, I think, a lot more disruption there, where the civilian space will actually lead a lot of interesting developments.
Yeah, as is normally the way that this stuff happens. So, Well, I don't want to take up too much of your time. We've been talking for a good hour. It's been a great conversation. I look forward to more offline conversations and online conversations. If I don't see you at SHOT Show, I definitely want to try to spend some more time together afterwards, when things theoretically get easier around here. So
definitely, you'll have to come over and fly some of our airframes and do some cool stuff.
Oh, for sure. Yeah. And then, I'll keep an eye out for stuff at SHOT Show that we might be looking for, and we can continue our conversation about sensor packages maybe next time. So thank you so much, David, for being on the show, and for all of the conversations that we've had. But I appreciate this one especially.
Thanks for your time, Isaac, and thanks for this opportunity.